41. In the coming days, Brogan was true to his word, or as true as an oathbreaker could be. Both a bar and a bolt were fitted to the door, which were to be fastened whenever he left the house, or when one of them slept. He had a second bed placed in the loft, ostensibly for an apprentice that he had not yet hired. He found it hard not to choke on the thought of Alba ever being his apprentice when her skill surpassed his in so many ways, but the lie was easier for others to accept than the truth. Unable to bear seeing Alba still wearing a sack when she should have been wearing clothing of much better quality, he sent Drogo back to the same tailor, with an order for some workday dresses and underclothes. He knew little of the lives of fine ladies, but he knew that in rich houses both the stillroom and the brewhouse were places where the castle chatelaine might reside. Such a lady would surely wish to train her daughter in the same skills, for she might be mistress of a fine household too one day. Brogan almost choked again at the thought of Alba or any niece of his as mistress of a fine castle, but Drogo didn't seem to notice. Like the clever boy he was, he ran off to carry out his errand with all of his usual eagerness and efficiency. When her new clothing was delivered, Alba almost refused to wear any of it, saying it was still too fine for the likes of her. But when she found an apron made of thick, dark linen that would protect her clothing from neck to ankle, she relented. Brogan did not dare tell her that the aprons were made to the same pattern as those worn by the crown princess. The first time he saw Alba wearing her workday wool, he was reminded anew of his oath to protect her. New clothing might protect her modesty, but it would not be enough against her brothers. At the end of the day, when he sent Drogo home, he followed the boy out into the street, where Alba could not go. Once out of her hearing, he told Drogo, "I want you to keep a watch. You and all your young friends, those who are too young to be apprenticed yet. One of you is to watch my house at all times, when I am home and especially when I am not. Should any of you hear a woman scream, like the girl ghost at Christmas Eve?" Drogo interrupted excitedly. Brogan frowned. He wished he could tell the boy the truth, but who would believe him? At least the boy believed in ghosts. Perhaps, though it might not be as loud as that. The sound of a woman in distress, or of a struggle inside my house. Is it true that ghosts can do that? Throw things? My friend Peter said. Yes. Brogan took a deep breath. He prayed Alba could not hear him. If you hear the ghost doing any of those things inside my house, have someone send for the city guards. They will know what to do. Drogo's eyes widened. The guards can fight ghosts? I thought only priests could do that. He looked particularly impressed. They will know what to do, Brogan repeated. Will you see that a watch is kept? Drogo nodded and raced off. Brogan's shoulders slumped. What more could he do? He was not some lord who could employ a squad of knights to guard his door. Drogo and the other street urchins would have to do. He prayed it would be enough. 42. With most of his customers expecting the shop to be closed until the new year, the newly installed bell rang rarely that week. Yet on New Year's Eve, Brogan was surprised to hear a decisive tug on the bell. When he did not answer the door immediately, a second, more forceful tug followed the first. Brogan hurried to unbolt the door. He found himself facing a grey-haired woman with a determined expression on her face. "How may I help you, mistress?" he asked. Her clothes were of good quality, though her fur-lined cloak looked worn beneath its light dusting of snow. Perhaps she was the wife of some wealthy merchant, for everything about her clothes spoke of practicality, not the spectacle of court. The woman pursed her lips. "I have come for some new shoes for my goddaughter," she said. "It seems she has outgrown all hers, but she will not wear anything that has not been painted." She glanced down at her own feet. Despite the snow caking them, her boots looked as well worn as any of Brogan's. "And it seems I may need a new pair as well." "We have been very busy with orders for court," Brogan said smoothly, spreading his hands wide. "But if you allow me to take your measurements and those of your daughter, perhaps I might find time between now and February." The sound of Alba swearing was enough to make him forget whatever he might have wanted to say. "Please excuse me," he said to the old woman and closed the door in her face. He turned to face Alba, her eyes wide and scared as though she'd seen a ghost. "Tell her she shall have her shoes tomorrow," Alba hissed. "She is the witch who cast the curse, and if she sees me—" A flash of ruddy light sparked near the fire, growing larger and larger until the flaming circle almost reached the ceiling. The witch stepped through her portal before the flames vanished. "It's not wise to anger a witch," the woman said, lowering her hood and shaking snow from her cloak. "Or to make them wait. As those who have already done so can tell you." Alba quailed beneath the witch's gaze. Yet when she spoke, her voice was anything but weak. "I will make whatever shoes you wish, working day and night until they are done. But only if you do no harm to Brogan here, and do not darken his door again. Your curse has done enough that he did not deserve." The witch's eyes narrowed. She removed her cloak, and hung it on the hook by the door. Next, she helped herself to a cup of the mulled wine sitting in a jug on the hearth. Finally, she seated herself on the bench where Brogan usually measured his clients' feet. She took a sip from her wine cup, then said, "I felt the curse break. Yet here you stand, as if it had not. The court swirls with stories of a shoemaker of such skill that he must surely have sold his soul to the devil, yet I recognize the work that was not done by his hand at all." She fixed her gaze on Alba once again. "On the day we met, you tried to spin me a story of how you needed my help, and I recall a promise that was made. Yet the story changed when your family appeared, and I had neither the time nor the patience to hear it. So I cast a curse, meaning to come back, to see if you had learned your lesson. Yet now, it seems you still have a story to tell. Now I have a seat by the fire, with a full cup in my hand. I believe it is time that I heard it." Brogan opened his mouth, not sure where to start. Alba got in first. "I will tell it," she said, "but I must ask Brogan to send for some more mulled wine because my tale is a long one." 43. Drogo had gone home for dinner, and it would be faster for Brogan to head to the tavern himself than to bother the boy, so Alba waited for Brogan to leave before she settled on the stool beside the witch's chair. "How many times did you accost carriages on their way to the city to beg for their help?" the witch asked. "I do not know," Alba said frankly. "My brothers kept telling me that this would be the last, but it never was, and by the time I realized it, it was too late to count. Yet I had no choice. If I did not do as they asked, they would beat me, starve me, or threaten to sell me. So I did as they commanded, preying upon the kind-hearted women who rode in carriages. While my brothers slipped inside and stole things, those fine ladies tried to help me. Of course, it wasn't always women. There were rich men too fat to ride a horse, or too lazy." Alba swallowed. "The sort of men who see a maiden in distress as a gift from the heavens to amuse them on their journey." Tears welled up, but she blinked them back. No wonder her brothers wanted to sell her to a whorehouse. She had not been a maiden for a very long time. "How many men?" Alba glared at the witch. "What does it matter? One was too many, more than any girl should have forced upon her." "And the handsome young shoemaker too?" Alba rose to her full height. "Leave Brogan out of this. He is a good man, a rare thing in this city, who has not laid a hand on me except to help me up." "So he has not made a deal with the devil?" Alba snorted. "Of course not, unless that devil is me. Cursed into a creature many might call a kind of devil. By you." "What kind of deal?" "You make him the greatest shoemaker in the land, and what? He will break the curse?" "My brothers tried to destroy his shop. They broke his tools, burned what they could, and destroyed what was left. I only meant to make a pair of shoes, a small gift to replace what was taken, but—" Alba shook her head. "I could not have known they could create such fervor at court. Or that she could not resist the call to work with leather again. No one has seen such shoes since the Crown Princess's christening. Your father's work was always exquisite, and you have inherited his gift. I made the shoes for the princess, Alba said. My father's hands were none too steady toward the end, and such delicate work fell to me long before that. I suspect my mother did most of it too, until she died. The witch considered this for a long moment before she said, So you agreed to bring the shoemaker fame and fortune in exchange for what? Alba shook her head again. I promised him nothing. I merely made shoes, as I always have, except when I was stuck here with my brothers and no one would rent the shop. That is all I have ever wanted. If my father had lived longer, or if my brothers had been willing to learn his trade as I was, I would still be here. He will never let you go, you know. He cannot, not if he wants to keep selling shoes to the court. There was pity in the witch's eyes. Alba did not want this woman's pity. Not now she was happy. Why would I want him to let me go? He gave me clothes far finer than the ones he had made for my brothers. He even made boots that would fit my feet, perhaps the finest pair he has ever made. He has sworn more than once he will set me free, and he has kept his word. All I need to do to break the curse you cast upon me is to dress in silk and soft leather. So why don't you? Because if I do, there is nothing holding me here. My brothers will have me back in an instant, ripping the fine clothes into rags, throwing me in front of carriages until they tire of banditry, when they will sell me as a whore for enough coin to fill their bellies. I would rather live the rest of my life naked and cursed, here in this house, where I might do the one thing I love most, than to leave. Alba's eyes flashed. You promised to help me, and I say you have kept your promise. I have my work, the one thing I wished for most. Now leave me to it, and leave Brogan alone too. Your conscience is clear. Begone, witch. The witch did not move, merely looking thoughtful. Dahlia. Mistress Dahlia, to those who recognize the rarity of an enchantress or want a favor from one, but Dahlia will do. Especially as it seems I already owe you a favor, and likely a second for what I must ask you to do. Alba opened her mouth to utter a decisive no. Oh, I know you wish to refuse, but wait until you hear what I have to offer. Even you cannot refuse this, surely. For what I must ask you could keep your brothers from ever bothering you again. It was as though the witch could read her mind. Perhaps she could. Alba pressed her lips together and gave a tiny nod to indicate the witch might continue. There is a sort of law among those with magical blood. We do not betray those we pledge our loyalty to, and while we are permitted to use our magic in ways that might harm others, we are only supposed to curse those who truly deserve it. It is customary to create a key to breaking a curse too, so that if the punished should ever repent, they might be freed from a curse they no longer deserve. I don't want, Alba began. But this isn't about you. This is about your brothers, who have robbed you as surely as any of their other victims, for they stole freedom that they did not earn. It isn't your fault but mine, a mistake I must correct. Your brothers must be caught and punished properly for their crimes. And as I have failed to do this the first time, I must ask for your help in accomplishing my task on my second try. The witch met Alba's gaze and held it. In return, I offer you anything that is within my power to grant, magical or otherwise. A wish, if you will. 2, if you are truly innocent of your brother's crimes. What do you say? Will you help me? I will, Brogan said grimly as he shouldered open the door. They burned my shop, stole and destroyed my supplies, then ran off with what rightfully belonged to Alba. I will help you, but not for wishes. He turned his burning gaze on Alba. My price is that you will do everything in your power to see that Alba is safe. That her brothers cannot harm her again. The witch gave a nod. Then we have the same goal. This seemed to satisfy Brogan, who began to set their dinner upon the table. But Alba was far from satisfied. She knew witches, and this one in particular, were twisty in their dealings. Her mother had told her many tales about what happened to those who broke a bargain made with a witch, and none of them had ended well. Not that she thought Brogan would break any bargain he made, he was too honest for that. So honest he might believe they had a bargain before the witch had agreed to one. A witch who might turn on him at any time, for nothing truly bound her to him or his cause. But the witch had offered Alba wishes in exchange for her help. If Alba agreed, then the witch truly would be her ally, and bound to help Brogan too. "I will help you," Alba said slowly, "in exchange for what you have promised." Now the witch's eyes were on her too. "We have a deal then." Alba should have felt relieved, but the cold hand of fate slipped around her heart, making her shiver instead. 44. Sunday dawned, and with it Alba's deepening dread. The virtuous had all gone to church, leaving her alone in Brogan's house. If the witch Dahlia was right, then her brothers would appear, and she could lay the trap they had planned. Alba half wanted Dahlia to be wrong, but the neighbors' voices had no sooner died away before she heard the sound she dreaded. "Knock, knock, little sister." She wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but answer the door and allow Oni and Gad inside, but she had made a deal with a witch, and she would not be the one to break it. Instead, she forced herself to stand her ground as her brothers entered the house. Oni dumped a bundle of rags on the table. "Put these on. Clothes are what breaks the curse." Alba eyed the bundle. She preferred her sack. "Those are rags, not clothes. Whatever happened to robbing the rich in their carriages on the road? Surely they'd be wearing silk and stuff like that." Gad spat on the floor. "Carriages can't make it through the snow, silly girl. Won't be any more of those until spring." For the first time in his life, Gad had given her a gift, the perfect opening. "That's not what I heard," Alba said slowly. "I heard they keep the road open to the mines southeast of the city. There's so much salt there, they use it to melt the snow for their supply carts. Salt comes to the city for the king's cellars, and he sends golden supplies back. Every week." Oni stared at her. "Where'd you hear that?" "I listen to the customers, when they come in here to be measured up for new shoes. Lots of court folk come here, and they like to talk. I heard the supply wagon broke a wheel this week, so it'll have twice the gold when it goes next week." She forced out a laugh. Half the salt ended up in the snow, so the less important courtiers didn't get any salt on their feasting tables this week. Some of Brogan's customers were most upset. And the week before that. Gad waved her into silence. "I don't want to hear the common gossip about town. Useless women's prattle." Oni looked thoughtful. He leaned over to whisper something in Gad's ear. Gad looked suspicious at first, but then he slowly nodded. "You keep those clothes somewhere safe. We'll come back for you," Oni said, tugging on Gad's arm. "Don't you even think of running away," Gad added, shaking a finger as he headed out the door. "Where would I go?" Alba called after them, but they were already outside in the street by then, so she doubted they'd heard. She crossed the room and pulled the door shut, praying to anyone who'd listen that her brothers would take the bait and attack the cart. When they did, Dahlia and Brogan would be waiting. With a whole troop of guards to arrest them, she hoped. 45. Alba reached for a cloth to wet the leather, so that she could stamp a design into the new shoe. But her fingers closed over the lip of the bucket without touching cloth. The benighted cloth had fallen in again. Swaying, she climbed onto the table to peer into the bucket. Something she wouldn't have to do if she was normal-sized, a nagging voice in the back of her mind reminded her. Yes, things had been much easier before the curse, before her father had died, when she'd been an ordinary shoemaker's apprentice, who hoped her work might please the king and earn her the title of royal shoemaker and a shop of her own one day. But she'd take this over the alternative any day. Of course, the cloth sat in the bottom of the bucket, taunting her. Alba reached in. Her fingertips burned as she touched ice, and she let out a little shriek. By all that was holy, the stuff was cold. "Are you well?" Brogan asked sleepily from the loft above. He'd retired for the night, as most people would, for the church bells had chimed midnight not long since, but Alba had wanted to work on. "Fine," she replied through gritted teeth as she thrust her whole arm into the bucket, leaning over the side so that she could reach the bottom. Damn, it was cold. So cold she could scarcely feel her fingers or the cloth she should be touching by now. One more inch. She stretched up onto her toes, setting all her weight on the side of the bucket as her feet lost contact with the table altogether, and still it was not enough. Just a little further. Too much. She slipped, the bucket sloshed, and in a heartbeat she tumbled from the table, a second shriek tearing loose from her lips that turned into a full-throated scream as the freezing water drenched her on the way down. Then darkness descended. 46. Brogan was already out of bed and on his way to the ladder when a shriek, a clatter, followed by a heart-rending scream had him leaping from the loft, landing in a crouch, the ladder forgotten. "Alba?" he asked uncertainly. Her seat sat empty, though her tools still waited to be put to use in decorating the plain-looking shoes beside them. His eye darted to the door, but it was barred, as always at this time of night. Her brothers could not have come in and taken her. "Alba? Are you all right?" He approached the table. Ice-cold water seeped through his socks to bite at his toes before he realized the floor was awash. The bucket that had held all the water now lay on its side, partially obscuring the motionless figure behind it. "Alba." She lay in the deepest part of the puddle, soaked to the skin. He gathered her in his arms, desperate to make sure she was still breathing. If her chest moved, he couldn't see it beneath the apron she wore to protect her clothes. He held a hand to her lips, praying that he hadn't lost her. The warmth of her breath against his palm almost drove him to tears. She lived. But he had to get her out of her wet things and into something warm, lest she fall ill. That's where he balked, for though she felt like little more than a child in his arms, he knew she was a woman grown. A woman who would not thank him for undressing her. He found a blanket and wrapped her in that, not willing to let her go. "Alba, please wake. I don't know what to do." If he lost her, he too would be lost. He should have made her better boots, so the curse would already be broken, and a bucket would not have nearly crushed her. "Ow!" Alba's eyes blinked open. He couldn't help it. He kissed her. 47. Alba's head hurt, making her wish she could retreat into oblivion once more, but someone held her, sending alarm bells tolling in her already ringing head. Her brothers, they couldn't be. She opened her eyes to Brogan's worried face, before the creases of worry were wiped away by surprise and blissful relief. Hers as well as his, for he meant her no harm. Then his lips captured hers, shocking her breathless. Warm and tentative, yet for all his gentleness, his lips stamped their mark on her as readily as she marked every shoe she made. She parted her lips to draw breath, and the breath was as much his as hers, a shared gasp at such a surprising yet natural moment. She'd never shared a kiss with a lover before, never had a lover, for the brutish pawings of the nobleman who'd ravished her had quenched any lustful feelings she might have had, but this, Brogan's lips on hers, melting her so completely both inside and out. She wanted to take him to bed now, so that some mutual ravishing might take place. The sort where she could remove her wet clothes and he could. A mighty hammering came from the door. "Brogan the shoemaker, open this door in the name of the king. If we find the woman with you has come to harm, then you will be spending the rest of the night in the castle dungeons." The guard bellowed so loud it hurt to hear him. He would wake half the city if Brogan didn't open the door. Brogan's panicked eyes met hers. "Hide," he hissed, setting her on her feet. "Yes." Alba held on to Brogan for a moment to make sure she could stand, before she clambered up the ladder as fast as she could. From the loft, she headed for her favorite hiding place among the rafters, where she was small enough to see from the shadows without being seen. 2 guardsmen barged into the house, their armor making Brogan seem small in comparison. "Your neighbors reported a woman screaming in distress inside your house." "Where is she?" one guard demanded. Brogan shrugged. "You may search the place from top to bottom, but you'll find no one here but me." "Who screamed then?" the other guard asked. Another shrug. "Perhaps one of the neighbors. A nightmare or someone falling out of bed. Maybe they saw a spider in the outhouse. Or maybe—" The first guard held up his hand for silence. "No. The boy said the scream came from here. From the shoemaker's house." Brogan's shoulders sagged for a moment before he regained his composure. "It must have been the ghost then. This house is haunted. Ask anyone, for it's common knowledge." The first guard turned to the second. "Search the house. I'll see that he doesn't interfere." The second guard nodded, then headed for the steps to the cellar. Brogan raised his hands in open surrender. "I have no intention of interfering. Please search the house. If you find the ghost, tell her not to wake the neighbors next time." The first guard frowned. "Does your ghost scream often?" Brogan forced out a laugh. "Perhaps. I confess I tend to ignore it now, particularly when I'm working." He waved his hand at the work table where Alba's tools still sat, with the shoes she'd planned to finish tonight. The water had missed the table and mostly ended up on the floor, to her relief. 2 pairs of finished shoes, their paint still wet, lined up on a bench before the fire, warming their toes. The first guard headed for the bench and reached for a shoe. "Don't touch those!" Brogan shouted, leaping to block the guard. "Those are a commission for the keeper of the treasury's wife. Her daughter is to be presented to the Queen next week as one of her new ladies-in-waiting, and she was very particular about the design. The flower is a family emblem and the pigments came from the Holy Land at great cost. Those shoes are worth more than you make in a year." Actually, the white flowers were painted with lime, one of the cheaper pigments Brogan bought from the tanner when he ordered another load of leather. Now the blue she used for the night sky came from the markets at the Holy Land, and the price was as astronomical as the stars she painted upon it. But courtiers craved that blue so much, they were willing to pay almost anything to see it on their shoes. So Brogan charged them accordingly and bought her more blue. The guard didn't seem to notice Brogan's lie. Instead he shouted down to his colleague, "Hey Moimir. Don't ever bring Jaka here. This man makes shoes for the quality. All painted like the artwork in the cathedral. You should see them." Moimir came up the cellar steps, shaking his head. "Only a fool would want paintings on shoes. Like you, Dimitri. And the only people who'd buy such a thing are those with more money than sense." He sighed. "No women in the cellar. I'm beginning to believe it might be a ghost. Better check the loft to be sure though." He headed up the ladder. "Do you have a woman in the house?" Dimitri asked Brogan. "If I did, she'd be making me supper, something to eat while I work or cleaning up after," Brogan said. "I'm a master shoemaker, and I'm far too busy making shoes for half the court to do such things for myself." Alba huddled behind a crossbeam to make sure Moimir didn't see her from the loft. It also hid her heated cheeks at the thought of what she and Brogan had almost done. Bedding him was one thing, but like most men of her class, he wanted a wife who would cook and clean for him. Perhaps if her father had not had such high hopes for her, none of this would have happened. When her mother died, he'd hired a woman to cook and clean for them, and as Alba had grown, so had her interest in his work. So he'd allowed her to paint and work leather, and when her attempts to cook had turned into burned messes, she'd been allowed to stay out of the kitchen and stick with what she was good at. Her father had wanted her to marry one of his customers, some high-born man who kept servants and had no need of a wife who could cook. or who knew a trade and ran a business of her own. So the shop had gone to her brothers with his command for them to take care of her, until she married and moved on to better things. If only her father had known they would disregard his command, or that no highborn man or merchant had ever expressed their desire to marry her, much less made an offer. It was a good thing the guards had interrupted when they did. Or she might have taken Brogan to bed, nay, put on the clothes he'd given her, then taken them off and taken him to bed, for without the curse broken, she'd make a poor bedfellow to a grown man. If he didn't break her in two. Oh, her cheeks burned even hotter at that thought. She glanced at the pallet where she slept, now the subject of the guard's scrutiny. "Does anyone else live here with you?" Moimir called down. Brogan barely hesitated. "No, no one." His lie shouldn't have hurt, but it did. It was a good hurt though, reminding her that she truly was no one to him, as she should be. "Then whose bed is this?" Moimir lifted the coverlet on her bed, and Alba's heart sank. She should never have allowed Brogan to bring such a thing up to the loft for her. It wasn't as though she slept much anyway. "That's for my apprentice. Being so busy and all, I thought it was high time I took on an apprentice. Only the boy I'd expected fell ill. So until he recovers or I choose someone else, it's just me." The brightness in Brogan's tone sounded so false, Alba was certain the guards would hear it and arrest him. Yet they did not. Instead, they finished their search and departed, wishing Brogan a good night. He waved them off, then shut the door and sank onto a bench, his head in his hands. After a long moment he said, "Alba?" She longed to answer, but pressed her lips firmly together. Their kiss had been a mistake. A delicious mistake, one to dream about in all the cold nights ahead, but still a mistake. One she would not repeat, or aggravate further by showing any more affection to Brogan. "Alba, I'm sorry," he said softly. "Sorry?" Yes. So was she. But for kissing him in the first place, or refusing to do it again, she could not say. 48. All too soon, Dahlia stood on Brogan's doorstep, ready to put her plan into action. Alba had already done her part, feeding her brothers the bait about the valuable wagon they might rob, and now it only remained to see if they were desperate enough to take it. Dahlia did not seem worried, sweeping into the shop as though she were queen of all the world. Well, she was a witch and a close friend of the queen, for she was the princess's godmother. Dahlia's eyes lit up as her gaze landed on the boots in Alba's hands. "Ah, they look magnificent," she said. "All they need is a little magic to make them perfect." Alba drew back. She had had enough of magic to last her a lifetime. The witch was so focused on her spell she did not notice Alba's reaction, or perhaps she did not care. The witch bit down on her lips so hard blood welled up, but the witch paid that no heed either. She waved her hands over the boots, repeating the gesture several times until she was satisfied. Then she gave a little nod and said, "There. That should do it. Though I should try them out first." Alba swallowed. She'd spoken little in the days after her kiss with Brogan, and her voice felt gritty from disuse. "Yes, please try them on. See that they fit. If they do, you may take them with you tonight. And your shadow will never darken this door again," Alba thought but did not say. Today it seemed the witch could not read minds, or she was simply too busy to do so. She took off her worn boots, and slid her stockinged feet into the new pair. Then the witch stood, tapped her foot 3 times on the flagstone, and vanished. Alba gasped. Brogan swore. "Oh, I'm getting too old for that," the witch said, sounding like she was in the cellar below them. The creak of footsteps on the stairs confirmed it. "And the toes on these pinch something awful. Is there anything you can do about that?" "I could rub them with oil, which would soften the leather somewhat," Alba said. The witch took off her new boots and dumped them on the table before Alba. "Yes. Please do that. I will leave these with you and wear my own, more comfortable boots for this little adventure. Do your other boots make you invisible too? Brogan asked eagerly. Dahlia snorted. Of course they don't. Neither did the new ones. What I cast is an escape spell. You see, when I am wearing the boots, all I need to do is tap my toes 3 times, and a hole appears, big enough for me to slip through. It works on walls as well as floors, opening doors where there are none. Wearing these boots, you could never truly be a prisoner, for no prison cell would hold you. Her eyes met Alba's as she said this, as though her words were not meant for Brogan at all. Perhaps the witch could read her thoughts after all. Would such a spell allow me to leave the house while still under your curse? Alba asked. The witch blinked. No, she admitted. The curse must be broken first, but after that. Why, you could walk through the walls of the strongest castle keep, as though there were no walls at all. Best keep those boots safe then, Alba, Brogan said briskly. We wouldn't want those to fall into the wrong hands before Mistress Dahlia comes back to collect them. Like her brother's hands. Alba shivered at the thought. But if all went according to plan, by the morrow, her brothers would be safely in a prison somewhere, unable to harm her or Brogan ever again. Their days of robbing carriages would be over. If Dahlia's plan worked. Alba prayed it would. 49. When Dahlia and Brogan had gone, Alba found a flask of oil and a soft cloth with which to work on Dahlia's boots. She worked the oil into the leather, wishing she knew more of the details of the witch's plan, but now it was too late to ask. All she knew was that Dahlia, Brogan and presumably a squad of guards would surprise her brothers when they tried to rob the coach. How, where, when, she did not know any of these things, for she had not asked. When Dahlia and Brogan had been making their plans, they deliberately left her out, because Alba could not leave the house, and the less she knew, the less she could tell her brothers if they came for her. Alba had bridled at the distrust in the witch's tone when she said that, and resolved to ask Brogan about it later, but then they'd kissed, and she hadn't been able to work up the courage to ask about the plan. Brogan at least knew she would never help her brothers, not willingly anyway. But the witch. Alba slammed the witch's boot against the table, rubbing as hard as she dared at the leather. If only she could wipe the witch's suspicion off her face as easily, she fumed. After everything her brothers had put her through, why would she help them? No one wanted them brought to justice more than Alba herself. Which was why she wished she'd swallowed her pride and asked one of them about the plan. Instead of just sitting here waiting, not knowing, worrying, wishing. Open this door in the name of the king. The guards had returned. Alba frowned. Yet today she'd scarcely made a sound. Certainly no screaming. Then why? The door flew open and 2 guards crowded inside. Alba's heart sank. With all her worrying, she'd forgotten the simplest of things, she'd forgotten to bar the door. Before the guards could stop her, she slid under the table, praying that she could hide. A hand seized the back of her tunic, dragging her out from under the table. Something cold and sharp touched her throat. You're going to help us, sister, or I'll slit your throat, Oni's voice growled. And when your shoemaker comes home, we'll kill him too. Alba's heart jumped into her throat, choking her. I can't. The curse, she began. Oni shook her, and the blade at her throat broke the skin, stinging like he'd rubbed salt on the blade. She wouldn't put it past him. A familiar bundle of rags lay on the table before her. Put these on. Hurry, for we have a carriage to catch. Gad grinned. Oni threw her on the ground, and the bundle of rags landed beside her. Get dressed. Now. Alba hurried to obey. There were more holes than cloth, and they smelled like someone had used them to clean a chamber pot. Yet one glance at Oni and his knife made her put the horrid garments on anyway. The shoes. Don't forget shoes. Alba would not call the things shoes. Someone had coarsely tacked pieces of oily cloth to 2 pieces of wood, presumably lashing them around their ankles and calves so the things stayed on. When they'd first been put together, these shoes, and she used the word loosely, might have lasted a week. That week was likely many years in the past, for the wood had worn so thin in places it might pass for parchment. Her feet would freeze before she crossed the street. But if she had to choose between frozen feet or death, and worse, Brogan's death, then she would wear this travesty pretending to be a pair of shoes. She peeled 2 strips off the hem of her, well, she supposed it was a skirt, and used those to bind the boots about her ankles. The moment she finished tying the second binding, the strangest feeling came over her. Fire flooded her very bones, and she needed to stretch, or her whole body would come apart at the seams. So she did, stretching until she thought her joints would pop, and yet she did not stop. An eternity or a moment passed, she could not be sure, but finally the feeling faded. "See? I told you," Oni crowed. "The whorehouse will take her now." "Whorehouse? No. No, I told you we need her for the job," Gad growled. While her brothers argued, Alba peeled off the cloth shoes and reached for the witch's magical boots. They fit her perfectly, the smooth leather caressing her feet as though they'd been made for her, not the witch. Gad thrust a threadbare cloak at her. "Here, put this on." She barely had time to fling it about her shoulders before her brothers grabbed her arms and dragged her out into the street. To the curious crowd outside, Oni said that she was a dangerous thief, caught robbing the master shoemaker. They were taking her to the dungeons. The crowd parted to let them through, courtesy of the guard uniforms her brothers wore. She didn't even want to think where they'd stolen them from, or what fate awaited her. At least, if she did not like it, she could use the witch's borrowed boots to escape. Though to where, she was not sure. 50. Just when Brogan thought Dahlia's carriage had been bumping and rattling for an eternity, it slowed to a stop. He looked askance at Dahlia. The witch shrugged. She did not seem perturbed, so Brogan did his best to keep calm too. It wasn't long before the driver opened the carriage door and bowed deeply. "Mistress, we have arrived at the inn," he said. "Ah, good," she said, allowing the driver to help her out of the carriage and down to the ground. Brogan emerged without assistance, staring around at the near-empty inn yard. No one in Casmiris had a yard this big, therefore they were definitely outside the city, further than he had ever traveled before in his life. Brogan swallowed. He was doing this for Alba, he reminded himself. If he was too cowardly to brave the safe confines of a country inn, where would he find the courage to face down both her brothers and see them brought to justice? Alba deserved a brave man, not a coward. The witch led the way inside, and Brogan lifted his chin as proudly as he dared, determined to follow her. She swept through the inn's taproom, making no move to sit at any of the tables, before her progress was blocked by a woman with a curtsy so deep you would think that the witch was royalty. She was the princess's godmother, Brogan reflected. Perhaps the witch did have royal blood. Her clothes were not that of a courtier, but for all their plainness, they were well made. Much like the boots Alba had crafted for her, made from materials both fine and practical, yet unadorned. He had to hurry to catch up to Dahlia and the woman he suspected was the innkeeper's wife, who were already halfway up the stairs to the next level. The woman led them to a small chamber with its own fire and a table and chairs, of finer craftsmanship than those in the taproom below. "Please make yourself comfortable, mistress," the innkeeper's wife said. "I shall have hot cider and hunter's stew brought up. Should you have need of anything else, merely ask the maid and it shall be brought to you." Another deep curtsy, and the woman was gone. "We're stopping for a midday meal?" Brogan asked. "What happens if our quarry overtakes us while we are wasting time here?" The witch laughed. "Be easy, Master Shoemaker. Jarek, the driver of the salt wagon, is a man of fixed habits. Every trip, he breaks his journey at this very inn. His horses are fed and watered, and he himself partakes in a full bowl of their famous hunter's stew. Most travelers along this road do the same. If our bandits have even a lick of sense between them, having researched their target properly, they will know this is the best place at which to steal the wagon. For while Jarek is at dinner, they can hitch up the horses and ride away. There is a crossroads a few hundred yards distant, where one road leads to the mine and another heads south for the mountains. The moment Jarek arrives, the maid will come to tell us, we shall go keep watch by the wagon, and when the men come to steal it, we shall catch them in the act. It sounded so simple, and Brogan wished with all his being that the witch was right. Shouldn't we be keeping watch? What if the maids are busy, and by the time we receive word that the wagon is here, the bandits have been and gone, taking the wagon with them? Dahlia shook her head. This place is almost empty, with more maids than customers. At midsummer, when the road is packed with travelers, perhaps such a thing could happen. But today? Nay, I will wager you as much gold as you make in a year that we will receive word of the wagon before the horses are even unhitched. You already owe me that much for those boots, for such fine leather does not come cheap, Brogan said. But if your plan goes as smoothly as you say, then my peace of mind and Alba's safety are worth more to me than a year's pay. If you are right, then you may consider the boots a gift. The witch nodded approvingly. You risk much for a girl you barely know. Are you sure she is worthy of your trust? Alba is nothing like her brothers. She is kind and hard-working, with not a speck of malice in her heart. Where her brothers would have burned my house down around my ears, she helped to build my business to higher heights than I could have ever dreamed possible. I owe her everything, and if it takes my whole life to repay her, then I shall make it my life's work. The witch opened her mouth to respond, but she was interrupted by the entrance of a maid. Soon 2 huge bowls of aromatic stew steamed before them, with a sizable jug of cider and loaf of bread so large it would feed a family in addition to the 2 of them. The witch breathed deeply. This is the best hunter's stew you have ever eaten, she said with a smile. I will not place a wager on that, for I know it is true. It is said the first time they made it was when a king slept under the roof, giving rise to the name on the sign outside, the King's Bowl. Which king or how long ago I do not know, but no man who can afford a bowl of hunter's stew, be he king or commoner, would pass this place by. Least of all Jarek, the driver we are waiting for. She picked up her spoon. So savour your stew, Master Shoemaker, and perhaps if you are lucky, once we have caught our quarry, there may yet be some left in the pot for you to carry home to the girl you hold in such high esteem. Brogan took a taste and decided to take the witch's advice. Catching criminals was so far beyond his experience that he must bow to hers. So instead, he let himself focus on the blending of flavors and the abundance of meat in his bowl, and anticipation at Alba's joy when he brought her both good news and a good meal. 51. This is perfect, Oni declared. Huddled behind him on the undoubtedly stolen horse, Alba lifted her head to see what could possibly be perfect. All she saw was an icy road that stretched as far forward as it did back. The only difference between this spot and any other they'd stopped at was that it was on a slight rise, giving more of a view than usual. Get down, Oni ordered. Alba looked about her, but there was nowhere to climb down from the horse without falling onto hard ice. How? She asked icily. A fist came out of nowhere, colliding with her jaw so hard she slipped sideways, and then there was no stopping her fall. The impact knocked the breath out of her, so that all she could do was stare up at her laughing brothers. If father could only see them now. Oni kicked his horse and rode out of sight, but Gad stayed, fumbling for something under his cloak. A cloak warmer than the one they'd given her, Alba fumed. What she'd give to be back in Brogan's house, sitting at the table before the fire. After a moment, Gad produced a crossbow. A loaded crossbow, which he pointed at her. Stay there. Don't get up or I'll shoot you. You don't have to be alive to be bait. Bait? So her brothers were going after the salt mine wagon. Having taken her bait, they intended her to be theirs. Oh, the irony of it! All she had to do was wait for the wagon to appear, and Brogan and Dahlia would turn the tables on her brothers. She just had to survive until then. 52. The sound of approaching hoofbeats, felt even through the ice, lifted Alba's spirits slightly before Gad's voice sank them again. And he asked. "It's no good," Oni panted. He sucked in a breath, then continued, "Between her pale skin and the color of her clothes, she blends right in with the road. You can't see her until you're nearly on top of her, and that's no good. If he doesn't see her, he won't stop. She needs to wear something more colorful." Gad glared. "Well, it's a bit late for that now, isn't it? No tailors or weavers here." Gad reached for his water skin and drank deeply. Oni's eyes lit up. "Here, give me that," Oni said, stretching out his hand. Gad hesitated for only a moment, before he handed it over. "What's wrong with yours?" Oni upended the water skin, squirting the contents all over Alba. She let out a yelp of protest as the cold liquid drenched her already ruined clothes. The strong smell of wine made her dizzy, but she waited until she was certain the skin was empty before daring to open her eyes. Her grey rags were now stained dark red, sticky and cold against her skin. If she made it out of this alive, she was going to drag the old dye bath up from the cellar, and heat enough water to have a proper bath. Gad has that crossbow in his hands again, aiming it unsteadily at her. "You stay there," he commanded. He pointed a thick finger at his brother. "You go see if she is visible from the road now." Oni grumbled, but his horse's hoofbeats said he'd obeyed anyway. It seemed a much shorter time until he returned. "Hide! Hide! It's coming!" Oni hissed. Then there came the sound of snapping branches as he and his horse headed into the woods by the side of the road. Gad hung back. "Don't you move," he said. "I'll be watching you, and if you so much as twitch wrong, I'll put a bolt in you. Don't you think I won't?" Then he and his horse were gone too. Before the curse, Alba might have talked herself into believing that her brothers did not mean to shoot her. Now she knew they were deadly serious. Well, she could make vows too. Oni and Gad were her brothers no longer. They might have been family once, but they were nothing to her now. The rumble of more traffic along the road had her holding her breath, praying that her ordeal was finally at an end. Now she could discern hoofbeats from more than one horse, along with the dull vibration of the wagon behind. An unfamiliar voice called to the horses to halt. Obediently, they did. The thump of heavy boots landing on the ice was close enough for her to feel it in her very bones. A big man, well-fed and wearing good boots. Much like the silk-clad beast who'd pinned her beneath his monstrous bulk as he battered his way through her maidenhead, splattering blood on the road. Like a newly forged sword thrust deep in her insides, she'd screamed at the pain until, "By all that's holy, what are you doing here?" The man wore so much fur that at first glance, Alba thought he was part bear. "Help," she said, her voice weak. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Please help me." "Of course," he said. Off came the thickly furred cloak, before he helped her to her feet. He wrapped the heavy garment around her twice before lifting her up to the seat at the front of the wagon. "You look just like my daughter Maria," he said. "What's your name, girl?" "Alba," she said, having no need to lie. "I'm Jarek," he said. "I have a skin of strong wine that I'd planned on bringing home, but I think you might need some to warm you up." His eyes held nothing but sympathy as he took her in. "I'll go get it, and then we'll be underway again." He disappeared around the side of the wagon, and Alba allowed herself a moment to relax. He'd open the wagon, the witch would hop out, and her brothers wouldn't be able to hurt anyone ever again. Thunk. "Or you didn't need to kill him," Oni complained. No, not Brogan. Alba twisted around in her seat, in time to see Jarek crumple to the ground, a crossbow bolt sticking out of his throat. He gurgled as blood bubbled from the wound, before an ominous silence fell. Behind him, the wagon door was still barred. "We better get out of here quick, before anyone knows we did this," Gad said. Oni nodded slowly. "Get up on the wagon. It'll be faster." Alba found herself squeezed between her two brothers, barely a moment before Oni snapped the whip over the horses to make them move again. "Aren't you going to check what's inside the wagon?" she asked. "Not until we're far away from that," Oni replied, plying the whip again. They crested the hill and a gust of wintry wind caught them. With only her face exposed, Alba was glad of the fur cloak, though she wished its owner sat beside her instead of her brothers. "Hey, that's much too big for you. Give it to me." Oni tugged at her cloak, nearly throwing her off the wagon in his haste to claim her gift for himself. Never mind that he had his own cloak, while hers had been left behind on the road when she'd fallen from his horse. All too soon, she had nothing but sodden rags to protect her from the freezing wind. "Stop squirming," Gad ordered. "I'm not squirming, I'm shivering and I can't stop. I'm too cold," Alba said. "Oni took my cloak." "My cloak now," the bastard gloated. "Let me ride inside out of the wind," she said. "Then I won't bother you. Or freeze to death," not that they cared about that. Her only hope was to get the door open and release the only people who would help her. Oni yanked on the reins, dragging the horses to a stop. "Fine. But if you're thinking of stealing anything..." Alba held up her hands. They had begun to turn blue. "I'm not, I swear." "Put her inside and lock the door so she can't escape," Oni ordered. Now it was Gad's turn to grumble as he dragged her down from the seat to the side of the wagon. He unbarred the door, opening it just wide enough to shove her inside, before slamming it shut again. The bar clunked down a moment later, trapping her in the darkness. "Hello, Brogan, Dahlia," she whispered, exploring the darkness with her hands in the hope of touching something that wasn't made of wood. But there was no answer, and the wagon began moving again, throwing her against a wall of what felt like casks. Something round and wooden anyway. "Brogan? Dahlia? Anybody?" But there was no answer. 53. Alba explored the cramped space as best she could in the dark. Most of the space was taken up by casks on one side and wooden boxes on the other, stacked from floor to ceiling. If there had been 3 people in there, it would have been a tight squeeze. As it was, with just her there, she found what felt like an almost empty sack and sat on it to cushion her against the rough ride. If her brothers didn't manage to shake the wagon to pieces before they reached their destination, she'd be surprised. Surely they'd break a wheel or an axle or some such thing. Though whether the boxes or the barrels would crush her first seemed her more pressing problem. So much for Dahlia's help. She knew she shouldn't have trusted the witch. Brogan would have helped her if he could, but if the witch misled him, he could be miles away and no use to her. Well, the witch wouldn't be getting her boots then, Alba mused. And if the witch wanted to hunt her down for stealing them, then she was welcome to try. For when she saw the witch next, Alba would not be holding her tongue. Nor returning the boots. They were her work, some of her best, and she'd brought in enough money for Brogan not to begrudge her the leather for them. And the boots had broken the curse, despite Dahlia's words to the contrary. Even witches were wrong sometimes. Of course, it had to be the one time Alba didn't want her to be wrong. Laughter bubbled up so hard she could no longer contain it. What with the rattling, rumbling wagon, her brothers wouldn't hear it anyway. She laughed so hard, drumming her feet on the floor until her feet felt numb. Or like there was no floor beneath them. Alba remembered too late about the bespelled boots. She dropped through the hole in the floor, narrowly missing the rear wheels as she tumbled to the road, rolling across the rutted ice until she came to a stop in a ditch beside the road. Something heavy sat on her chest, making it hard to breathe even if she hadn't felt black and blue and bruised all over. She lifted her head to look, and found the sack she'd been sitting on had turned the tables. It wasn't empty either. Inside was a squashed loaf of bread and a water skin. Her mouth tasted of blood from where she'd undoubtedly bitten her tongue in her fall from the wagon. Alba uncorked the skin and drank deeply. Fire burned down her throat, setting her insides ablaze. Jarek's strong wine, not water at all. She silently thanked the man for his kindness and foresight. She did indeed need this. But perhaps she could still thank him. If he lived, she could help him, and if he didn't, perhaps she could at least see he had a decent burial. And that the city guards knew who slew him. She ripped a hole in the sack, wide enough to poke her head through, then one more so that one of her arms was free. She took another gulp of warmth from her wineskin to fortify her, and set off back the way she'd come. Oblivious to her escape, the wagon driven by her brothers bounced away behind her. 54. A maid burst into the room panting like she'd raced up the stairs. "Mistress Dahlia, it's Jarek and the salt wagon," she said. "Only he's got someone with him. Hard to tell who, they're going so fast. And they don't look like they're slowing down." Dahlia rose. "Have my carriage made ready immediately. Brogan, it's time." Finally. Brogan followed the maid down the steps, running out into the yard. Only then did he realize Dahlia wasn't behind him. He debated whether to go back inside for her, but decided to stay with her carriage instead. The horses still had to be harnessed up to it, and her coachman would hardly leave without her. By the time the witch did appear, everything was ready and waiting, and all she had to do was step into the carriage before they set out. "Do you want me to catch them, mistress?" the coachman asked eagerly. "No, I want a smooth ride, please, Constantine." "A steady pace but not too fast," she responded. "But they'll get away," Brogan protested. The look Dahlia turned toward him would have frightened a much braver man. But all Brogan's fear was fixed on what her brothers might do to Alba if he let them go free. He had nothing left to make him quail before the witch. "They will not. The fools are whipping their horses into a frenzy to go so fast. I saw the wagon, it's a miracle it hasn't shaken itself to pieces already. Though perhaps one of those poor horses might die first. Either way, they will be waiting for us on the road when we arrive. If they're fool enough, they may try to take this carriage too." She sniffed. "Hanging is too good for them." Brogan would be happy to see them hang, if only to make sure Alba never suffered at their hands again. They did not need to go far. They found one horse dead just past the crossroads, and the wagon with the second dead horse only a mile further along. "Stay inside the carriage unless I call for you," the witch ordered. Brogan opened his mouth to protest. Witch she might be, but he'd never heard of a woman besting two men in a fight. Alba's brothers were brigands and surely knew how to fight better than she. "Be quiet, or I will send you to sleep on the floor of the carriage until this is over," Dahlia said. "Don't underestimate an enchantress. Especially not one with the sight. You will do as I say if you want to go home with that girl of yours, and make babies with her." Brogan's cheeks burned. He hadn't been thinking of such things, but when she spoke of them, the most distracting pictures popped into his head. "Constantine, you're to stop well away from them. Climb down and approach the downed wagon to see if anyone needs help. When you are far enough away, then they'll spring their ambush." "I will be ready," Dahlia said. "As you wish, mistress." The burly coachman didn't seem the slightest bit worried about his mistress. Perhaps she was as powerful as she said. Constantine hailed the downed wagon, his voice growing fainter as he got further away. Without warning, Dahlia jumped to her feet, shouldered open the door and jumped out of her carriage. "No you don't," she shouted. Something thumped to the ground outside the carriage, followed by a second thump, heavier than the first. After a long pause she said, "Master Shoemaker, you may come out now." Trying not to look like he'd been cowering in the carriage during combat, or whatever had occurred outside while he'd been sitting there, waiting for her summons, Brogan stuck his head through the door. What he saw was enough to reassure him into stepping out onto the road. Two men lay face down on the ice, though the one under the bearskin cloak was only identifiable as a person by the shoe peeking out from under the voluminous folds. Dahlia stood over them with a look of disgust on her face. "Take the fur cloak and the crossbow. These two won't be riding inside with us. Constantine, help me tie them to the roof." Obediently, Brogan bundled the massive cloak up in his arms, taking it to the carriage, before returning for the crossbow. Dahlia stretched her hands out, palms up before her, and the two men began to float from the road to the roof. Brogan stopped, fascinated. He'd never seen magic performed like this before, and it was wondrous to behold. "Use plenty of rope," Dahlia advised her coachman, who now stood on the driver's seat, his hands resting on the roof, ready to receive his charges. "I don't think they'll break this spell so easily without their sister to help them, but there's no trusting tricksters like these. Make sure you tie them tightly." The coachman made quick work of his task, and they were soon underway again, this time toward the salt mine. Dahlia stroked the cloak with sadness in her eyes. Jarek did not deserve this fate. I had thought to deliver justice, but now, I'm not sure they have enough years left to live for justice to truly make up for what they have done today. She said little more until they arrived at the salt mine, a place that looked more like a village than a mine. When a man approached to ask their business, Dahlia asked to speak to the head overseer or whoever was in charge. Things moved swiftly then. The two men were dragged down from the roof and marched into a low building with barred windows, while he and Dahlia followed a well-armed guard into the great house. "Lord Salinas, this is Mistress Dahlia the Enchantress and Master Shoemaker Brogan of Casmiris." The guard bowed, gesturing for them to enter the chamber beyond. Brogan walked into a low room not unlike the tap room in the King's Bowl, though it lacked a bar and the crowd of patrons he would expect in an inn. The lone man inside didn't look like a lord, at least, not like the courtiers she'd seen in his shop. He was dressed like a man who worked for a living, but in a trade that paid well. Presumably, salt mining did. "Mistress Dahlia, Master Brogan. Please sit. Have some wine." Lord Salinas gestured to the bench opposite him, as a servant rushed forward to set out cups and a fresh jug of wine. "We get few visitors here, particularly in the winter months. If you have come from Casmiris, do you bring urgent word from the king?" He drank from his own cup. "My own man Jarek was supposed to leave Casmiris today. He could have carried your message and saved you the trouble. I regret being the bearer of bad tidings, but Jarek met with ill fortune on the road from Casmiris. The two men who visited it upon him are now locked in your cells. Because of this and other crimes they have committed, I wish to question them, and ask your help in ensuring that they meet with suitable justice." Lord Salinas spread out his hands. "How can I be of service?" 55. Even when Alba's brothers were manacled hand and foot, still Brogan didn't trust them not to try to escape. So while the witch questioned them, he stood by, with Lord Salinas standing in silent judgment beside him. "You've got the wrong men, mistress," Oni said, his voice high and righteous. "This is all our sister's fault, as wicked a woman as you would find anywhere. As if Eve and Jezebel were born again within a single woman's body, armed with the devil's own seductive tongue." "Alba!" Brogan snorted softly. They could not be speaking of the same girl. "Tell me about your sister," Dahlia instructed. "Well, it was all fine when father was alive. We all worked hard in his shoemaking business, the place now owned by Brogan over there." Oni pointed. Brogan shrank against the wall. He wanted no part in this story. He was the royal shoemaker, a master at his trade, and we were well off, but it was not enough for Alba. She fancied herself as good as any of the ladies who came into the shop, putting on airs and wanting to wear silk every day like she was in court. She planned to seduce some lord into falling in love with her, so that she might live in a castle like a queen. Oni took a deep breath. Oh, she was beautiful on the outside, but she had a wicked, wicked heart. Every coin we worked so hard to earn she spent on silks and furs. Our father loved her so much, he worked himself to death to give the girl what she wanted. His dying wish was for Gad and me to provide for her, just as he had. Of course, being dutiful sons, we could not deny him, and promised to take care of her. We worked and worked, but two of us could not earn enough at shoemaking to satisfy her appetite for finery, and she demanded more. When courtiers came past, she would point at the carriages and clothes, and insist upon having whatever it was that the noblewomen had. At last, unable to bear her nagging at her command, we took a chest of clothes and jewels from a carriage that she swore was hers but had been stolen from her tailor. But even that was not enough for her voracious appetite. Despite working all day and night, we could no longer afford food or rent, and our landlord evicted us. Forced to leave the city, we found shelter at a cottage in the woods beside the road. Day after day, Alba would watch the carriages go past, raging at all the finery we had been forced to leave behind that she could see noble women wearing. She insisted we must stop the carriages and demand they return her things. Oni buried his face in his hands and gave a great sob. To my great sorrow, we did. We soon began to suspect that her tongue was forked, that she lied about owning so many things, for the nobles in their carriages claimed they were being robbed, calling us bandits and other such things. But when we suggested this to her, she flew into a rage, screaming that we had promised father to take care of her, and if we were to break an oath made to a man on his deathbed, then we would surely go to hell. Oni sniffed. I feared for her soul, but I feared for my own more, so I did as she bade me. Gad was quicker to see the truth of it than me. One morning, when she raged at a new carriage that had appeared on the road, he set upon her with a rod, determined to beat the evil out of her. He beat her until her fine clothes shredded, but still the devil would not leave her. Finally, his arms grew too tired to lift, and she screamed that she would claim her property herself if we were not man enough to do it. You probably remember that day, mistress. She ran up to your carriage, her clothes hanging in ribbons, but she had no care for her modesty like a normal woman might. Instead, she begged for your help. Help she did not deserve, as you saw so clearly when you cursed her. Brogan found himself shaking his head at such vicious lies. This was nothing like the Alba he knew, or the history she'd told him. It couldn't be true. Couldn't be. What about today? How came you to be on the salt wagon today? Dahlia asked, her voice flat and calm as though she heard tales like this every day. Surely she couldn't believe them. After the curse, all that we owned, all her finery, disappeared. She found a way to break the curse with the help of a simple-minded shoemaker, but she refused to leave him until she'd managed to seduce the location of her missing things from him. When faced with such a beautiful woman, he was no match for her womanly wiles, and he told her everything. Then she told us it would be in a wagon traveling along the road to the mountains today. All we had to do was wait for it to come past and take it back for her. But when she saw the wagon, she went mad. She screamed that the man driving it had stolen her fur cloak, and she produced a crossbow, which she must have concealed about her person somehow, and shot him dead. Then she proceeded to take the cloak off his corpse. Of course it was too big for her to carry, so Gad, quick-thinking man that he is, overpowered her while she was distracted, and commanded me to open the wagon so we might lock her inside. She screamed curses at us through the door, beating her fists and likely her feet against it too, but she could not escape. He drew in a great, jagged breath. And so, we took responsibility for the murdered man's coach, seeing as his murderer was safely locked inside, and drove it to the nearest town, where we hoped someone would be willing to mete out justice for the murderess we have the misfortune to call our sister. Where is she now? Dahlia asked. Still locked in the wagon, I'd wager, Gad said sourly. We were only bringing her to justice, doing the right thing, when you took us prisoner without letting us utter a word in our defense. She's the real villain here. You should have taken her." Brogan's breath caught in his throat as the man's words sank in. Somehow they'd managed to kidnap Alba and lock her away, and he'd left her there on the road. She had to be terrified. "I'll go get her," he heard himself say. "Take my carriage. Constantine will drive you. I must finish questioning these two and break the news to Jarek's daughter." Dahlia looked grim. Lord Salinas piped up, "I can send a squad of my guards with you. If this woman is as dangerous as they say, you may have need of them." For one heartsick moment, Brogan wondered if there was any truth in Alba's brother's words. If she were truly the devil incarnate as they said. "My coachman is more than capable of subduing an unarmed girl half his size. Sending 2 men is more than enough," Dahlia said dryly. "Why, the master shoemaker alone is capable of seeing to the girl. Is that not so, Master Brogan?" "Yes, of course," he replied, his thoughts whirling. If she was innocent, he would not let anyone else near her. He would protect her with his life, as he'd promised. If she was guilty, why, he would be honor-bound to bring her to justice, as well as shamed for having let her fool him too. He needed to speak to her, to hear the truth from her own lips. Every word she'd told him rang true, while her brother's falsehoods left a sour taste in his mouth. 56. Darkness had fallen by the time they reached the wagon. The dead horse was still harnessed to it, and Brogan blessed the frigid air for freezing the animal before it had started to smell. The wagon had cantered over toward the corpse, so it took the efforts of the two of them to heft open the door. Inside lay a jumble of casks and crates. Brogan held his torch high, looking for some sign of Alba, but the wagon's cargo had evidently buried her from sight. "Help me shift these. She must be underneath somewhere. If they haven't crushed her." Brogan worked feverishly to lift things out of the wagon, which Constantine set on the road. He lifted until his arms ached, and then he lifted some more, because if Alba was alive under there, he had to save her. Finally, he had to admit the truth: she was not in the wagon at all. His heart swelled with joy. Her brothers had lied. He knew it. Alba was safely at home, and with her brothers in the mine prison, she would finally be free of them. "This is strange," Constantine said, holding up what looked like a bracelet. "It looks like one of the silken ribbons girls wear at court, but it's made of leather." Brogan snatched it from him, examining the thong in the light of his torch. It had been tied around something, then finished with a bow, precisely like Alba tied off her braided hair. He rubbed the leather between his fingers, definitely good quality, well worked with the kind of softness preferred by court ladies. He untied it, and traced the edge of the strip of leather. One side was cut straight across, but the other had a curve to it, like it was one of the scraps sitting on the table after he'd cut a shoe. Except that the curve was more precise than anything he'd ever cut. No, this had been cut by the hand of a true master of the craft. The sort he watched at work every night. He didn't want to believe it, but she was here. But she must have escaped somehow. Even as the words left his lips, Brogan didn't believe them. It had taken 2 men to open the wagon door. Alba could not have lifted it. Unless she'd made her escape while the wagon was moving. Brogan wet his lips. "We should head back to the city and search the road." The witch would have ordered her coachman to do what she wanted, but Brogan was Constantine's equal, not his superior. And if the witch had given the man different orders, Brogan doubted Constantine would deviate from Dahlia's approved course of action. "Mistress Dahlia said you know her best, and she wants the girl found. You might want to come sit up front with me. 2 pairs of eyes are better than one when searching in the dark." Constantine winked. "And you'll want to take one of the furs from inside the carriage, to keep you warm. Riding in the driver's seat is not like walking, the wind chills you instead of the effort making you warm." Gratefully, Brogan took the coachman's advice, and they set off again, peering into the dark. Brogan prayed she wanted to be found, for if she hid in the woods, with the temperature dropping rapidly, she might freeze before morning. 57. Alba wasn't sure what she hated more, the endless road, the chilly winter air that bit through her thin clothes, or the sour smell of Gad's cheap wine which made her queasy. It was the smell, she finally decided. The witch's borrowed boots were the most comfortable shoes she'd ever worn, not to mention warm, and Jarrick's wine helped her with the cold. But the stench permeated everything. A stream ran beside the road, taunting her about her wish to have a bath. The water would be icy, but her roiling stomach told her it would be worth it. She needn't immerse herself, just wash off the wine. The sun was sinking by the time she gave in to temptation. She stripped off the wine-soaked rags and used one of the cleaner patches to scrub the stickiness from her skin. She put the boots back on and the sack, but she left the wet rags where they lay. It wasn't like they were much protection against the cold. Instead, she took a mouthful of Jarrick's wine and continued along the road. Slowly, feeling came back into her toes and then her fingers. She wished she could wash the wine from her hair too, but that would have to wait until she could dry it before a fire. A comb wouldn't have gone amiss either, for she could feel her braid unraveling. She must have lost the piece of leather she preferred to tie it with somewhere along the way, likely when Gad had thrown her into the wagon, or perhaps when she'd first landed on the road. Never mind. She could cut another one from the next pair of shoes she made. If there was a next pair of shoes. Of course there would be. She would keep walking until she reached Casmiris and the work waiting for her in Brogan's house. She'd stoke the fire, find some more suitable clothes, and return to her work until he came home. After that, the future was uncertain, but Brogan would not begrudge her her tools, with which she still might make a living. Somewhere. If there was another shoemaker willing to take on a girl apprentice. But she would worry about that later. Now she forced herself to put one foot in front of the other, folding her arms across her chest to keep the warmth in from an occasional sip of strong wine, and focus on not losing her footing in the dark. She counted her steps aloud, for there was no one to hear her. At 2,000, full dark fell, and she had to stretch her hands out before her to make sure she stayed on the road, not wandering into the forest. At 5,000, the wineskin slipped out from where she'd tucked it under her arm, and it took her some minutes and plenty of swaying before she found it again in the dark. At 6,000, she slipped on the ice and resolved to drink the wine more sparingly, for she could not afford to fall again. If she knocked herself unconscious, she might freeze by morning. At 9,000, the moon rose, lighting her way just enough for her to see that she still kept to the road. At 11,000, she drained the last few drops from the wineskin. Yet still the road stretched on. Just before she reached 13,000, she thought she heard horses on the road behind her. She almost laughed. So many times her brothers had forced her to seek help from random travelers on the road. Now she was free of them, the first thing she might have to do was stop a carriage and ask for help. Not knowing whether the traveler was a lust-crazed beast or a kind man, like Jarrick. One thing was certain, whether she managed to get their attention or not, she would not be robbing or killing anyone tonight. No, that was her brother's trade, not hers. Her trade was in shoes, and with her own feet as her witness, she made the best boots on this side of the mountains. Perhaps even between the mountains and the sea, for the king's kingdom stretched that far. Now should she try to hail the carriage, or should she hide in the woods until it had passed? The carriage crested a rise, all lit up with lanterns like the cathedral at Christmas. All she had to do was step back off the road, among the trees, and they would never see her. Alba! Alba! No, they couldn't be calling her name. No man she knew owned a carriage. Well, the witch did, but... Wait, I think I see something. Slow down. That was Brogan's voice, she was sure of it. Or she was dreaming, her wishes fueled by the wine and the cold. Nevertheless, Alba stood still, waiting and wishing. If she was wrong, she could start walking again when the carriage had gone past. There! Stop! A faceless shadow climbed down from the wagon, a silhouette that spoke with Brogan's voice. Alba! Is it really you? She opened her mouth, but her voice had died somewhere along the road, and she hadn't even noticed. So she nodded, hoping he could see. He took off his cloak, and it became a swirling shadow that engulfed her in warmth. Warmth that would take life from him, even as it gave it to her. No, stop, she managed to say, trying to push him and the cloak away. They'll kill you for helping me. Like they killed him. The cloak only tightened about her. No, arms tightened about her, lifting her up. Like a princess in some story. But she was no princess, and her story was no fairy tale. No, Brogan, they'll kill you. They said if I didn't come with them, didn't help them, they'd lie in wait and kill you, Dot and me too. He had a crossbow. Gad had a crossbow. Was going to shoot me. Shot the kind bear instead, Jarek. Said he had a daughter. Only wanted to help me. He didn't let go. Instead, he leaned in and said, your brothers are both in prison cells in the salt mine. They can't hurt you anymore. Not my brothers anymore. No family of mine, she said, even as the tears spilled over. Tears she could not seem to stop. Brogan didn't seem to mind. He carried her into the carriage, out of the wind, and the door closed behind him. Where to, Master Brogan? Home. I'm taking her home, Brogan said. The carriage began to move. 58. Brogan almost didn't believe his eyes when he saw a ghostly figure walking beside the road. She was too tall to be Alba, he thought, before his brain caught up and he remembered that she could not have left the house without breaking the curse. She was no longer the tiny elfin waif who'd felt like a child in his arms. She was a woman grown, a woman he loved and wanted. A woman he would protect from the witch and her brothers, and anyone else who tried to harm her. He climbed down from the carriage before it had stopped, not wanting to wait. In the lantern light she looked like little more than a ghost, clad in a coarse sack, just like the first time he'd seen her. But this time her head reached his shoulder, and when he wrapped his cloak around her, the curves he felt beneath the heavy wool were everything he could ever want in a woman. She babbled nonsense about her brothers and danger, tears pouring down her cheeks. One thing was certain, she'd been through a terrible ordeal. An ordeal he'd tried to save her from, and failed. He intended to make it up to her now though, tonight, and every day for the rest of his life. The reassuring weight of her in his arms as he carried her to the witch's carriage made his heart sing. She was a real woman, no longer a waif, and he would save her. It wasn't too late. They were closer to Casmiris than the mine, so he asked Constantine to take them home. If the witch wanted her, she could come and get her. Both of them, because Brogan wasn't leaving Alba again. So cold. Need to get out of this. She struggled to take off the sack with her frozen fingers, and Brogan hurried to help her, grabbing a blanket to shield her modesty while she stripped off. When she was securely wrapped in the warmest fur he could find, he pulled her into his lap and draped his cloak around them both. You'll warm up faster this way, he said. She nodded, squirming until she'd managed to curl up against his chest, her bottom resting perilously on his groin. If it wasn't for the thick furs between them, she'd be able to feel. Blood rushed to his cheeks too. Her gaze fixed on him, reading his very soul. I didn't think you'd come for me, she said softly. When my brothers took me, I couldn't even leave a note to say goodbye. I'm sorry. A new tear trickled down her cheek. Brogan wiped this one away. No, I'm sorry I left you there without anyone to protect you. I should have stayed. The witch didn't need my help. My place was with you. I didn't realize it until today, but I truly am lost without you. I know you haven't been free of the curse for very long, and you may not have an answer for some time, but I wish to make my wishes known. I want you to be my wife, Alba. Let me protect you always and be the family you deserve." She lowered her eyes. "You deserve a better wife than me, Brogan. One who can cook and keep your house and all the things a good wife should be able to do. I cannot cook, and I get so lost in my work I forget to clean or any of the other things a good wife should do. The only thing I am good at is making shoes, and my father and my brothers made it abundantly clear that it will never be enough. I'm a girl and I will never be the shoemaker he was. Never." Brogan couldn't help it. He chuckled. "You make shoes so beautiful they drive the king's court crazy over them. Your father and your brothers, even me, will never equal your skill. It would be a crime, nay a tragedy, for you to do anything else. Marry me and my shop is yours. Make as many shoes as you wish and take me as your apprentice, so that maybe one day I'll be able to make something half as good as you. There are women enough in town willing to cook and clean for a few coins, including among our neighbors. Hire whoever you please. I will give you anything you want, if only to have you as my wife." She raised her head. "And what about love? Could you love someone like me, Brogan? A girl who cannot do women's work, whose only worth is making pretty trifles for courtiers?" He didn't hesitate. "I do love you, Alba, and I will love you until I draw my last breath. You have given me everything, a business where I had nothing, a home where there were only ghosts, and courage to do things a lowly shoemaker should not even dream of doing. Why, for you I was willing to fight bandits. With you at my side I'd take on a dragon. And probably lose, so it was a good thing dragons did not exist. Marry me, Alba. I will love, protect and give you anything you ask for as long as I live." 59. 3 times he'd asked her to marry him, so she could not have misheard. Even after she'd confessed she could not cook, he still wanted her. She shifted in his lap, the unmistakable hardness beneath her telling her he wanted her as a woman, not just for her shoemaking skills. She'd nearly died so many times in the last day, was lucky to be alive at all. When her father had wished she'd meet a man who wanted to marry her in his shop, he hadn't meant another shoemaker, but what her father wanted no longer mattered. For once, someone was asking what she wanted. She moved once more, so that she was facing Brogan, her breasts pressed against his chest through the fur. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Then she took his face in her hands and kissed him, just like they had before the guards had interrupted them. There was no one to interrupt them now though, and she was no longer the tiny, cursed elf she'd been then. Somehow her desires seemed to have grown along with her body, and she knew Brogan felt the same. Why wait? She tugged at her furs until none remained between them, then lifted the hem of his tunic so her flesh touched his. By all that was holy, it was like being bathed in fire. She wanted him so much. "Are you trying to seduce me?" Brogan asked, his voice hoarse. She felt her cheeks redden. "I'm doing a clumsy job of it, aren't I? I've never tried to seduce someone before. It's not as easy as making shoes, is it? With practice it might be. We will have all our lives together to find out." Though his words urged caution, his body wanted her as urgently as she needed him. "I want to feel loved. Now. I don't want to wait until the wedding. I want you." She stared up into his desire-darkened eyes. "Show me how you will love me." "As you wish." His hand slid slowly down her body to her hips, angling her ever so slightly toward him. An unspoken question begged her from the depths of his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then repeated louder as the hard heat of him filled her so deep. Better than strong wine, he warmed her from within like nothing else. She didn't want anyone or anything else. Just him. The sheer joy of his touch, thrusting inside her even as it pushed her deeper into pleasure, she hadn't believed possible. "Don't stop." 60. Alba woke in Brogan's bed, stretching muscles that had seen more use in one night than they had in years. They'd made love twice in the carriage and again when they reached Brogan's bed, and now she could feel him stirring beside her. The desire to do it a fourth time was all she could think about. "Oh, Alba," he sighed with pleasure as she sank down on top of him, his body moving with hers as though they were one. It was nearly noon by the time they climbed down from the loft. Brogan stirred the fire into life, while Alba searched through his clothes for something that might fit her. Everything else he'd bought her was now much too small. Perhaps if she bore him a daughter one day, the girl might wear those fine clothes. Alba herself would certainly never fit into them again. She stared at the shoes she'd been making yesterday, but could not summon the will to work on them now. Instead, she set about cleaning the witch's boots, the ones she'd borrowed. They would never be new again, but she might be able to make them look nearly new. She oiled them and she rubbed them, but it was no use. She would need to make another pair for the witch. Then Brogan brought breakfast from the bakery, and all Alba could think about was how long it had been since she'd last eaten. But it no longer mattered. She had him and a home here, and it was almost too good to be true. Of course it was. The clop of a horse's hooves outside slowed, then stopped. A customer. Alba rose from her seat and headed for the loft, to hide. Once they were married and she had some suitable clothes, she could meet Brogan's customers, but until then, she would pretend to be a ghost again. So she crouched down in the darkness of the loft and listened. The door opened, then slammed shut. "I've come for my boots and to see our business concluded." "Where is she?" Dahlia demanded. "I will not tell you until you swear to me you will not take her away from here against her will." Why would the witch do that? If her brothers were in prison, she had nothing to fear anymore. If they weren't. Alba climbed down. "Where are they?" "I won't let you take her," Brogan shouted. "She's innocent, I'd swear it on my life." "Did you ask her?" The witch's words hung in the air, heavy with suspicion and light on mercy. Alba did not expect mercy. Last night had been more than she had any right to expect. She didn't wait for him to ask. "No, I am not innocent. If I had not agreed to go with them last night, Gad might not have brought a crossbow. Jarek might not have helped me and he might still live. I might have been dead, with Brogan's blood on my hands too, though I have never killed anyone and hope never to need to. I helped my brothers distract the travelers they meant to rob, because then they wouldn't hurt anyone, and maybe they wouldn't hurt me either. If I had not helped Brogan after my brothers burned this house, they would not have been set free to prey on innocent people once more. I have committed no crime, but I have stood by and watched them happen, doing nothing to stop them, because if I did, I knew I would be their next victim. Perhaps I was innocent once, before my father died, but he left me in the care of my brothers, and in so doing destroyed any innocence I might have known. An innocent has not seen what I have seen, has not been subject to the torment I have known, have not feared for their life at every turn. Until last night, when, for a brief moment, I felt a mite of relief when I believed justice had finally caught up with the men I once called my brothers. If they had escaped from prison, then they would come for her blood, believing she had betrayed them. If last night was her last, she would die happy. So I ask you, witch, after all I have done, after enduring years of being confined to the same house as my tormentors by your curse, after what you claim to owe me, where are they? Dahlia closed her eyes. She seemed to shrink, bowing her head as she bit her lip. They will spend the rest of their lives in the salt mines. Until they find a way out of that too, Alba finished for her. The only way out is death. A mixture of magic and more mundane methods this time, for you are not the only one who deserves justice here. Jarek was well liked, and the overseers would have been happy to see your brothers hang for their crimes. So they are confined to the mines, where they must work every day of their lives, or they will not live to see the morrow. And if they try to escape, the overseers get to mete out their own justice. They will work harder than any shoemaker, and they will never see the sun again. Slowly, Alba nodded. It was a fitting punishment, she supposed. The king's laws rewarded brigandry with death, but Dahlia's form of justice seemed fairer somehow. After everything they had done, a lifetime of labor suited them. "Then I have a gift for you," Alba said. She took the boots from the table and held them out. "I borrowed them when my brothers took me from here, and walked many miles in them. They are no longer new, but they are still your boots. Without the spell upon them, I might have been caught with my brothers and punished for their crimes yet again." Dahlia took the boots. "Thank you. I foresee I will have a good use for them in the future, but that is another's tale. Curses and water wheels and spinning straw into gold. Perhaps they may even save another mother and her babe from harm. I have a gift for you too. A name for the child you carry, though you did not know it yet. You must call the boy George, for dragon slaying is in his blood." This drew a surprised reaction from Brogan, but he waved for the witch to continue. "George, or as they say it in the common tongue here, Jarek. Fitting indeed. Thank you. If we have a baby boy, that's what we'll call him." Dahlia produced a small sack that clinked, then tossed it onto the table. "I lost a wager to Master Brogan, and those are his winnings." Neither Alba nor Brogan touched the bag of coins. "Now there is the matter of the debt I owe you, Mistress Alba. 3 by your count. What would you ask of me?" It was on the tip of Alba's tongue to say she needed nothing from the witch, but even as she opened her mouth, she knew it would not be true. Alba took a deep breath. "I would ask you, should anything happen to me or to Brogan, or if he is far from home and we cannot, please watch over our children so that no son or daughter of mine shares my fate." Dahlia considered for a moment. "You ask me to be godmother to your child? The one thing you ask, and I cannot grant it. Because I will only grow older, and if I have made mistakes before, who knows when I shall make more. I am not a good choice for godmother. Even the crown princess. But I cannot speak of that yet, for what is to come may change, though much rides on her future. A future that is entwined with that of your son too. I will offer you something better. Name my own daughter, Zoraida, as your child's godmother. She is young and strong, and may be more use if your son should encounter any dragons. Our son will be a shoemaker. If he is lucky, he will be as good as his mother," Brogan said. "He'll be sensible enough to leave slaying of dragons and other such monsters to knights and those who have the training for it." Dahlia covered her mouth with her hand, but Alba saw the smile she hid from Brogan. Alba wondered what the witch knew that they did not. It mattered not. She would teach her children all she knew of her trade, from using lime to tan fresh skins into leather, right up to painting the finer details on a pair of court shoes. If they chose a different path, at least they would have an honest trade to fall back on, should they fail. Alba became aware of Dahlia's expectant eyes on her, as though she wanted an answer. "I'm sorry?" Alba said. "Master Brogan wants to know how I saw through the false testimony your brothers concocted for the man who runs the salt mine. My answer was silk. I have seen you in sacking and wool and linen, but never anything else. How often have you worn silk?" If this was a trick or a test, Alba didn't know what the woman wanted to hear. So she told the truth, "Never. When Brogan had clothes made for me that might break the curse, there was a lovely dress of fine silk, the sort I imagine courtiers wear with the shoes I make. But such things are not for women who work, like I do, so I chose to wear the wool instead, and that only with an apron to cover it. I'd ruin it with paint splatters before the day was through. A terrible waste of something so fine." Dahlia inclined her head. "A fine sentiment, but there will be an occasion soon where you will have little time for work. Your wedding day, I believe. You should wear the silk dress then." And with that she left. 61. They were wed not in the grand cathedral, but in a small wooden church near where Brogan had grown up. His family and friends filled the place, leaving Alba no room to regret that she had no family or close friends to invite. She'd lost all her childhood friends when her brothers had taken her from the city, and it would take time to reacquaint herself with her neighbors. As Dahlia had suggested, Alba wore the azure silk gown Brogan had bought her to break the curse, topped with the ultramarine cloak. Though both should have been too small, the witch had worked her magic over all the clothes Brogan had bought for her, including the boots he'd made. He'd slid them onto her feet himself that very morning, and she had to admit she could scarcely wait until the time came for him to help her out of both the boots and her gown. But in the meantime, she was too busy meeting and greeting their guests, accepting their congratulations and trying to remember all the new names. No one seemed to mind her frequent blushes when her thoughts strayed to last night in the loft, or the wedding night to come. Brogan's new niece squalled loudly, though Alba wagered she'd scream even louder at her baptism the following week, when the priest doused her in cold water. She doubted even her gift of christening shoes would quiet the child. Would her son be more like her or Brogan? Alba's hand flew to her belly, though it was still too early for her pregnancy to show. She was only a few days late. If Dahlia hadn't already told her about the baby, she would not yet have suspected his existence. But she'd seen the knowing glances that passed between the guests, whenever anyone mentioned how quickly she and Brogan had chosen to wed. Let them think what they wished. She had married the man she loved, and together, they were building a future they could one day share with their son and all their other children. And if she ever told the tale of the elves and the shoemaker to her children, it would be about how the shoemaker and his wife freed the elves, who ran away with their new clothes, never to be seen again. A pretty story that would not feed childish nightmares, like the truth would do. Where is the master shoemaker? The crowd parted to allow a guard through. Not a city guard, he wore the tabard of the palace guard, not something often seen in this part of town. I am Master Brogan. Brogan's fingers slipped out of her grasp as he stepped forward to meet the guard. You must come with me, Master Brogan, the guard said. But it's his wedding day. Brogan's brother, Geryon, shouted. He hasn't yet bedded his bride. Titters erupted from the guests. But not from the expressionless guard. The master shoemaker and his wife are commanded to come to the palace for a royal audience. Dahlia had a hand in this, Alba was certain. For who else knew Brogan was to be married here today, aside from the assembled guests? A dozen hands helped Alba smooth her hair and set her clothes straight, while others did the same for Brogan. When they were pronounced good enough to go to court, the crowd parted to let them and the guard leave. To Alba's surprise, a carriage waited for them, adorned with the white eagle crest of the king. The guard sat in front with the driver, leaving her alone with Brogan. He laced his fingers through hers. Do you think the king will mind if I kiss you in his carriage? He will never know, she replied before his lips touched hers. Several kisses later, the carriage slowed as it entered the castle walls. Reluctantly, they broke apart. Servants opened the carriage door and offered Alba assistance in stepping down. The palace guard had gone and a well-dressed woman approached, then curtsied. Follow me, she said before Alba could do the same. Brogan's hand gripped hers as the noblewoman led the way into the castle. Not to the public halls but higher, to the private chambers where the royal family lived. Your Majesty, the master shoemaker, the woman said, before curtsying so low her skirt puddled around her. The woman rose and moved aside, gesturing for them to enter. The girl who had made the crown princess's christening shoes would have hung back, fearful of what awaited her. But Alba was no longer that frightened girl. She stepped across the threshold first, bringing Brogan with her through the strength of their joined hands. 3 steps into the small chamber, she had to stop or crash into the room's sole occupant, a woman who wasn't much older than she was, though her heavily pregnant belly said she had been married longer. Mindful of her manners, Alba curtsied too, her silk skirts spreading out in a shimmering pool. A glimpse of red made her raise her head just a little until her gaze fixed on the queen's boots. Whoever had colored the leather had spread a thin tint of vermilion over an already warm brown, instead of bleaching the leather and using the proper amount of vermilion to create the rich red royalty deserved. "Master Shoemaker, I have summoned you to have some shoes made for my daughter's betrothal to the Viscount Prince," the Queen said. "What does your Majesty have in mind?" Brogan asked. "Half my court wears shoes made from your shop. Even some of my ladies. Each with designs as different as the women who wear them, never the same. They say your power to produce perfection borders on the miraculous. Exactly what I want in my royal shoemaker. What sort of shoes would you make, on the occasion where two kingdoms are to be joined?" "Vermilion slippers bright as fresh blood, adorned with a white eagle, its wings spread for flight across the front," Alba blurted out, spreading her fingers across the Queen's shoe to demonstrate. "Perhaps a gold crown on the heel if you wish for more height, but if it is a state occasion, surely you will wear a dress with a train, so no one will see the heels. What color will your gown be?" Alba raised her head to find both the Queen and her husband staring at her. "Ah, Your Majesty," she added. "Does your wife often speak for you, Master Shoemaker?" the Queen asked. Brogan coughed, though it sounded more like a laugh he was trying to hide. "Your Majesty, I may be a master shoemaker, but my wife's work is what graces your court, not mine. She was the royal shoemaker when I was little more than an apprentice. That she chose me to work alongside her in her late father's, the former royal shoemaker's, shop, is an honor I fear I do not deserve." "No one told me the royal shoemaker was a woman," the Queen said. Alba felt her cheeks redden. "My father was the last official royal shoemaker, Your Majesty. Though during the illness that took his life, I made most of the shoes that left our shop. The Crown Princess's christening shoes, for instance. They were exquisite. Her new sister will wear them at her christening." The Queen patted her belly for a moment, then turned her gaze on Alba once more. "Eagles and crowns, you say? Like my husband's family crest?" Like a mother eagle about to take flight to defend her nest, her amber eye fixed upon those who might threaten her and hers, Alba said, already envisioning the painting in her mind's eye. Against a background of red, the color of the blood she would shed to protect her kingdom and its allies. The Queen leaned forward. "What color gown would match such magnificent shoes?" Alba thought for a moment. "White, with red and gold embroidery. Perhaps a red veil over your hair, held in place with amber or gold. Forego a train if you wish your shoes to be seen properly, though I would suggest gilded crowns for the heels, which will glitter when they catch the light." The Queen clapped her hands. "Oh, I like it. What is your name, Royal Shoemaker?" When she realized Brogan had no intention of answering, for the question had definitely been directed at her, she replied, "Alba." "Well, Alba, you may take my measurements now so that you may start work," the Queen said, extending her foot. "As my royal shoemaker, I expect my shoes to take priority over any lesser commissions." "Yes, Your Majesty," Alba said. "Would you like a pair of new boots to replace the ones you are wearing too? I made some in a particularly soft black leather for the Crown Princess's godmother, Mistress Dahlia the Enchantress. But for you perhaps red or white." "Why not both?" the Queen interrupted eagerly. "Why not indeed?" By the time the Queen had finished ordering a dozen pairs of new shoes, dark evening clouds had replaced the sunny daytime skies, and the Queen sent them home in her carriage, complete with a substantial bag of gold to cover her purchases. The carriage rolled to a stop, and the driver opened the door. Snow swirled in as the last winter blizzard began to make its presence known. Brogan bounded down to the cobblestones and held out his arms. "Mistress Royal Shoemaker, allow me to assist you." He lifted her from the carriage, not letting her feet touch the ground until they were under his roof. A merry fire blazed in the hearth, and someone had laid out a veritable feast on the work table. A barrel of mead sat at the foot of the ladder to the loft, with 2 cups waiting to be filled. I'll move some of this, so that we can start work right away on the Queen's commission, Brogan said, regret coloring his tone. Alba held up her hand. The Queen can wait until tomorrow. Tonight we are newly wed, and I have heard the most elaborate stories about what happens to a bride on her wedding night. We have the rest of our lives to work. Tonight there shall be no shoes. Just you and me and maybe a jug of that mead up in the loft. So no more working nights? Brogan asked hopefully. Alba closed her eyes. Now the curse is broken, I am free. I shall be the royal shoemaker while the sun is in the sky, and once it sets, I will be your wife and nothing else. Brogan made a show of peering out the window. The wind slammed the shutter closed, so he bolted it. It's too dark outside to see any sign of the sun, so come wife and let me show you what my bride deserves on her wedding night. He held out his hands, then grasped her around the waist and lifted her up to the loft. He scrambled up after her. Off came the silk gown and the shift beneath, mixed with the wedding finery Brogan shed as fast as his hands could unlace it. When they were naked, she grabbed him, tumbling him into bed. Beneath the blankets they made love as husband and wife for the first time and the second, and, much later, a third, for they agreed that newlyweds can never have too much practice at such things. The storm raged outside, but Alba and Brogan noticed none of it, for they had finally found and united the perfect pair. This has been Cobble, Elves and the Shoemaker Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.